The other thing that happens with these things is we archive a copy at Grand Valley's. Okay, so we'll get into that a little later. All right. Oh, if we're ready, I will start. All right. We're talking today with Mr. Tom Jillson of Hudsonville, Michigan. The interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Now, Mr. Jillson, can you begin by giving us a little bit of background on yourself? Start with where and when were you born?
Sure. I was born in 1947 at Butterworth Hospital right here in the Grand Rapids area. East Grand Rapids is where we lived, home of Gerald Ford, and our family did know and meet them. As a matter of fact, drove to Washington, D.C. and met them. Went through the Oval Office when he was down there, as a matter of fact. And I had conversations through mail with Gerald Ford. It was kind of interesting to grow up in East Grand Rapids, which is kind of a little better to do area. Surprisingly, most of the kids that graduated high school in East Grand Rapids went on to college immediately. And I'm sure my parents had that planned for me as well.
Before we're going to go there, what did your father do for a living?
My father was an insurance state agent, which meant he was a consultant, effectively, to the agents around the state of Michigan and traveled. He was home probably most of every weekend, but 3 or 4 days in the middle of the week, he was out visiting throughout the state. Halfway through my growing up, he got transferred to Traverse City, Michigan, and started a home office for the home insurance company in his home, and traveled from there, which was a lot less cumbersome for us because we got him home a lot more at that time. But that was only 3 years. And it was like 9th grade, 7th, 8th, 9th, and partway into the 10th grade, and then we moved back down to East Grand Rapids and took over my high school work at East Grand Rapids High School. About the time I was ready to graduate, a buddy of mine decided that it was time to go look at the military and see what the recruiters had to say, so I went along with him. He didn't join, but I did, that same day, as a matter of fact. Joined the Air Force and got kind of excited about it. The reason I chose the Air Force is my brother Victor, who is a few years older than me, twin to my brother David, joined the Air Force and was stationed in Biloxi, Mississippi, working in electronics, which was exciting to me. Electronics, technology. When he came home on leave, he would build a radio or something like that. It got me really excited that the Air Force could do that kind of thing for people. So that was kind of what I had in mind. I wanted to join the Air Force, learn technology, and I did. As a matter of fact, in the first few months, I got into technology. Halfway through my training, which I'll get to in just a moment, but first of all, I joined in June, graduated in June, joined in June, and was shipped out to Detroit to get mustered in, do all the paperwork. Took about 3 or 4 days to get through the mustering process because I had some hearing problems, they said. So they went through all sorts of testing and finally passed me through and sent me down to Lackland Air Force Base and at basic training. This was right at the beginning of the real rush of kids joining the military because of Vietnam, 1965.
Yeah. Now at that point, you're saying rush to join the military. Was that rush to avoid being drafted, or was it just coming out to serve your country because they needed people?
I felt the patriotism, the reasons that I joined. I felt a draw because I wanted to get in the military. I wanted to help. I wanted to, stop what bad things were going on. I don't think it had anything to do with missing the draft. Again, I had only been 18 for a few weeks and hadn't even entered my mind that would happen. Didn't bother me because I was ready for it. It was the right thing to do. College material, I could have gone to college and probably would have signed up for Grand Rapids Community College and on, but I heard the nice recruiter talking about all the things that I could get out of the military for education benefits, and which I did use once I got out. When I joined the Air Force, got switched down to Texas to get into Lackland Air Force Base, they had shortened the basic training from the normal 13 weeks or 12 weeks to about a 5 to 6 week impacted training, and then they would send us out to our whatever training that we were going to go through for our career and finish it up at that point.
Okay. Now describe that first phase of training. I mean, what was that experience like?
The Lackland Air Force Base and the basic training, I've talked about it many times. As a matter of fact, when my other brother, the twin of Victor, who had already been in and out of the Air Force, joined about a year and a half later, I visited at Lackland Air Force Base when he was going through it. And the proof of what I'm going to say, I could describe as I watched him. Well, what Lackland Air Force Base or any basic training for any military person, and they can attest to this, I think their job is to break you down to a 2-year-old and then build you back up into a man or a woman, if it's a woman joining the Air Force or joining the military. And they did a very, very good job of making me feel totally inadequate, but then start building some belief in myself and to trust in the people that were directing me as the officers and NCOs, et cetera, that were in control of whatever our lives were at that time. We learned how to dress, we learned how to shave, we learned how to make sure our haircut looked good, polish our shoes, and to spend 4 hours polishing your shoes to the spit shine seemed like a very inane thing to do. However, it was important to the process to make us feel proud of what we had. And if there was a little dot of water on our shoe, we knew that that was a bad thing. Today, I don't really care if I walk through the snow and ice, but back then it made a big difference.
Did you have a sense that the people who were training you, the drill instructors and so forth, that there was a sort of a logic to it, and if you sort of learned to do it their way, you were fine? Or did they play more games with your head than that? Or
they played a lot of games with all of our heads, and so did some of the people that were appointed as our student or our squad leaders, whatever else, that weren't any further along than we were. But they were somehow recognized as being a leader or having leadership talent. Yet I don't think that they had the clue of what the overall plan of basic training was. But certainly there was a plan. And the intent had worked for probably 200 years to bring somebody in, getting them to trust the people that were going to tell them what to do when they got to the battlefield or whatever else, to be able to respond quickly and the way they were told to, and not just start thinking, maybe that's not a good idea, and maybe I'll just not do that. And anyway, they got to that point with all of us. Sergeant Cahill, I remember him to this day, getting right up to my nose and looking for the whiskers that I hadn't grown any beard up to that point or anything else. That's kind of why I have one now. I had to be clean shaven, and he, ran me through the whole roll to notice that I had a couple whiskers showing, and I should have shaved better or whatever else. And he was a nice guy, but you couldn't see that during the day. You could only see that during his downtime, and whenever we got a chance to just sit down and whatever. He would drink a beer, and we would drink our milk or whatever, and until we turned 21.
All right. Now, when you got through that phase, well, what did you do next?
That phase went so quickly. It's unbelievable. I learned marching tactics, and I learned all sorts of things. We did an awful lot of marching, an awful lot of calisthenics, and an awful lot of that kind of stuff. But it felt like, a couple weeks went by, and all of a sudden the 6 weeks was over, and I was shipped out to where I didn't know I was going to. They didn't tell me that I was going to go up to Chanute Air Force Base in Illinois to learn electronics. And I said, fine, that sounds good. And they wanted me to get into this electronics. It was a 54-week training program. Okay, that's technology. That's exciting. That's building the radios that my brother did. But the interesting thing is that it was really geared towards the Hound Dog missile, which was phased out before I got done with my training. So they transferred me out of that. But during that period of time, since I was in the long electronics course, there were also people that just came in to be an electrician. They might have been there for 12 weeks or 16 weeks, and then they were gone. I was in the 54-week program, so almost immediately when I got to Chanute Air Force Base, I was appointed as a green rope, which was a squad leader.
Okay.
And holding that green rope just meant that I had a little bit of authority over these 6 or 7 guys that were in my barracks. And then after the first batch of those kids had graduated and gone on to their being an electrician or whatever else, I was appointed as a red rope, moved up a stage, which meant I was in charge of a whole squadron, I think it was larger than squadron, but I can't remember what the group was. But that red rope meant green ropes reported to me. And we had discussions about what to do about specific infractions of the rules, or, make things nicer for the kids. I always called them kids once I got to that authority level.
And you were
I was
just
I was younger than most of them. Some of the fellows had come in halfway through college, or at 20 or 21 years old, and here I'm still 18 or 19. But that didn't matter, nor did it matter even for the career folks. They always had young kids coming in as second lieutenants that were their boss, regardless of it. They've been in the service for 30 years, but they only had 7 stripes, which reported to this little guy that came in brand new, been in the military for 2 weeks, and the second lieutenant could tell him what to do. And just an interesting hierarchy. It didn't take me very long to realize that I was not going to be a career military. I was in there for the short term. I was in there for my 4 years of duty, and that was going to be it. But I also felt that I really wanted to do what I joined the military for, and thinking Vietnam at that time that I joined, I wanted to get to Vietnam. Didn't think I was going to get there. After Chanute, after the training, the decision halfway through that said the Hound Dog missile's not going to go forward, and we're not going to continue this program for these folks, you have a choice. You could either get into cryptology or you can get into accounting. And I didn't think cryptology was really career directed towards outside the military, and I knew I wasn't going to be career military. So I chose accounting, and that was probably a good move. Switched me down to Webb Air Force Base, which is a little base in Texas, in West Texas. When I flew in the first time to that base, I thought, in the airplane, I looked out the windows and lights forever. I thought it was the biggest city in the world, and I said, how come I didn't hear about this? We got down there and found the town was probably about 3,600 people, or maybe 4,000 people. All these lights were the oil wells in West Texas. And flew into that and realized that this was just the towers and the pumps out there in the wilderness. In Texas, West Texas, there's nothing for 50 miles in every direction. The town was called Big Spring, and the Big Spring was a little tiny trickle in the park in the middle of town, and that was about it. The closest actual water that you could swim in was 17 miles out of town. It was levied up reservoir. And it was kind of interesting. We drove out there quite a few times. I worked like a regular job for 2.5 years while I was stationed in Texas, and got to know a lot of the local folks, and got to meet some of the families of some of the other people that lived in that area. My roommate happened to be in charge of the civilian, or actually the kids of the military. I can't remember what they actually called it. It was not a USO or something like that. We had those as well. But they had a place where the kids of the officers could go to and just kind of play. He was the director of that, so I got to go along with him on his job quite often and got to meet quite a few of the folks. And I suspect it was my relationship with one of the colonel's daughters that perked him up a little bit, and that's probably why I ended up going to Vietnam. He said, I don't think so. So
what did your duties actually consist of while you were there on the base?
I was in accounting. There, I was straight an accounting clerk. I did payroll runs. Interestingly, computers is what I'm doing now. I work for a company called Trivalent, which is a network group now. But back then, I was a key punch operator. So even in the mid-'60s, I was working in computers and technology. But the interesting thing then was, instead of doing paychecks, we would do these key punch cards. And there was a key punch card for every employee, every payroll run. And we'd have to take that box of cards for all these folks over to the computer, run them through to alphabetize them. 26 times, one for every letter of the alphabet to get them all through A through Z. And then I would carry that back, and then we'd actually run those cards through a check printer, and it would duplicate the information basically on a check and put the payroll together. I also did temporary duty. Probably the most important thing that happened during that 2.5 years was I learned my first sales words from one of the clerks that worked alongside of me. His name was Bill Boyer, and I couldn't figure out why all these officers and all these folks that came in to do their temporary duty paperwork would always gravitate towards Bill rather than me. And at that particular time in my life, I couldn't understand why anybody would spend any moments of their life talking about sports or talking about anything besides the business at hand. My job was my job, and that was why I was there. But Bill always took the time to listen. He never shared a one thing about him, but he always listened, and what he always said to people was, "Is that right? Oh, that's really interesting. What else happened?" He asked the questions, and he showed interest, and he showed me really how to sell, to listen and to care about people. And it was not overt for him. He didn't know he was doing this, but I was learning from him, and I really appreciated that. And that memory has stuck with me all the way through. Didn't become a salesperson. I was an accountant at that time, remember. Didn't become a salesperson until probably 2 years after I got out of the military and realized, put those two pieces together and kind of went on in that direction.
Of course, in his case, there was no particular profit to be generated by having people come to your
No commissions or anything else, but it's just I felt, why do they like him and why do they not like me? Well, it's because he cared, and he didn't do anything different except listen. So I learned how to listen at that time.
And you listened to the colonel's daughter well enough to be sent somewhere else.
Yeah.
How does that come? Did you just get a notice sent to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't too long after, a couple dates, and, she probably mentioned to her dad that she was, seeing this enlisted guy, and, he probably shook his head. And I think I even got sent to talk to the chaplain for a moment to say that's probably not a good idea for you to go along with your buddy to this place anymore and see this particular girl. Whatever, okay. She was good. I was nice. I was a good, straight up guy, but it still wasn't something that he wanted to deal with. At least that's my suspicion. Right. I have no proof, other than the chaplain telling me about that. But yes, I just did get a note. Noticed that within 2 weeks I would be shipped out, and I had 2 weeks of vacation or 2 weeks of leave that I could take beforehand. Went back home, got ready. Got shipped out to, took a commercial airplane over to California, and waited for 3 days to get a transport plane. We were expected to take a commercial plane over there, but by the time 3 days had gone by and we were sitting in this airport, we were ready to take anything. So we ended up going on a transport plane, a C-140, with a cardboard box of sandwiches. That was our lunch as we went over there. We stopped in Hawaii for about 35 minutes, and I happened to know the senior master sergeant that was stationed with me back in Texas that was stationed there, so I called him and let him know that I was coming in. He hustled over, and we got to talk each other for about 15 minutes, and then I had to take off and went over to Wake Islands, which was, you say Wake Islands, and you think that's an actual place to go, but I think there was like 12 people on the island wearing T-shirts and shorts, and that was it. And flew out, got more gas, and dropped off some boxes that we had taken to there, and went over to Da Nang. Landed in Da Nang on April 18th, I believe. Maybe it was
67.
It was 68. And it was a good time. We came in during the day, and it was a good time to just get adjusted for about 3 days. Didn't know where I was going to be or what I was going to, who I was going to work for or whatever, but it was quickly assigned where I was going to be in the barracks and with all the other accounting folks. And then my only task for the first 6 months was to be a clerk at the airport, where the airplanes came in for all the military coming in country, or the military going out of country and going back home, or even civilians. The first 5, 6 months, I had to meet every airplane, and what that entailed was one airplane. Most every day was one airplane, and about 11 o'clock at night. So the good news about that was I didn't have to work during the day. I didn't have to report to the office, didn't have to do anything. I just waited till my airplane showed up, and it was about a 45 to 50-minute task to make sure everybody went through and traded their money for green money they couldn't use in country to the military pay certificates, which I traded for each one of the quarters, dimes, nickels, and dollars, and $10 and 20. I think we had the 20s at that time.
So why weren't they letting people just use American money or bring their money in with them?
A couple reasons. First of all, green money around the world is always on a black market, people wanted to get the green money just for whatever reason. And there was a value to it, so they would actually pay more in whatever trade that they were giving. So we wanted to keep it out of the military hands. I mean, that was the intent of military pay certificates. And that had to happen since World War II. Every conflict, every combat zone, folks were given this paper money. Another couple reasons why is because of the jingling change that they didn't want in the Marines and the Army in their pockets, which would be a giveaway that somebody was there. If you're trying to hide, it's not a good thing. But a little piece of paper which is worth 5 cents doesn't jingle. So they wanted to get the change out of the hands of the military as well. So truly, every dime, every penny, not pennies, they could keep pennies for whatever reason. But there wasn't that many of them, obviously. But every nickel up had to be switched for paper, and that was my job. The first 5 months I did that, and then I did get a couple tasks of taking cash out of the office in Da Nang, and we had to take a helicopter or a transport plane or whatever down to a couple of the little cities or towns around to pay contractors, Australian contractors, Canadian contractors, and others. Some of them didn't want checks, some of them didn't want MPCs, so we had to actually take them green money. And I had a Marine sergeant that went with me, which was my guard, and we never really got in too much trouble. I had the bracelet around my wrist, taking this money down to them, but the Marine sergeant was my bodyguard for that purpose. We went down to Pleiku, which is a little town probably 40 miles or 50 miles south of Da Nang. Da Nang was right on the border, right near the demilitarized zone. Da Nang was an interesting place too. The China Beach television show was taken on China Beach, was probably about 12, 13 miles out of town, right on the ocean. Interesting thing I mentioned in the first 5 months, I didn't work except at night. So I had to find things to do during the day. And the interesting things that I did is I found a camera, and I got a camera. I had the only television in my barracks, and so everybody kind of gathered into my booth in my little cube that I lived in to watch. I think we had Bonanza, and I think we even had Star Trek at that time. And that was a fun time. We actually had good times. I had the benefit of getting to know some of the people that were in the barracks all day long because I had nothing better to do, no work to do, no work assigned, till the first sergeant found out that I was free and found things for me to do. But we played cards. I didn't see, and I'm sure there was stuff going around, but you always hear about Vietnam and drugs and all that kind of stuff. I did not see that. I guess the crowd that I gathered around me and the crowd that happened to be around me was not that group.
Well, you were in a barracks with a bunch of accountants, right?
Well, yeah, maybe that's it. Maybe that's the reason. But we did get into poker, and we did get into roulette wheels, and we did get into some of the gambling stuff, which was somewhat condoned. I mean, we did it pretty openly out in the middle of the barracks. Barracks, and then the latrines were all up the middle of the area. And on the inside of those barracks was where the airplanes, the fighter jets and everything were kind of stored. But it was interesting to me that around the perimeter of the base, they put the personnel. knowing that rockets and snipers and everything else were right on the outside edge. There's 2 fences on the outside edge with barbed wire and controlled and towers and everything else. 2 separate lines, and it was the demilitarized zone that we had around our base was probably about 40 yards between those 2 fences. The other interesting thing to me, too, was along with the personnel and the barracks around the edge of the base, the hospital was set right on the corner on the outside edge. Where the helicopter came in to bring in wounded and everything else was right there on the edge, and always have snipers out there just taking pot shots at the helicopter pilots, and didn't seem smart to me that that's the way they built the base and intended it. But you know, I guess there's no protection when you're flying in anyway, whether you're 60 yards further in or whatever. But
now, what was sort of the general country like? Was it hilly or fairly flat, or?
The monsoon area, the area that I was in was a lot of vegetation. The interesting thing in the buildings that we worked and lived in were, when we first got there, we were interested to find that in the United States, you see all the plugs on the walls, you know, close to the floor, you know, just foot and a half up from the floor. All the power and everything else was about 5 feet up. They were up in the middle of the wall, and we could never figure out until monsoon season came through. And the water in our accounting offices and everything else, everything was built to withstand about 1.5 feet of water trenching through there for a 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 day period of time when the monsoons would hit. But Vietnam, in that area, was very lush, a lot of trees, a lot of green, a lot of dirt roads. There was almost nothing paved. But between Da Nang and China Beach, there was a good paved highway, and every day there was probably 6 or 7 buses that would take us from the base out to China Beach so we could actually go to the beach. And the beach was fun. It was probably the most beautiful beach I've ever been on, with about 7 or 8 military guys on blankets. That was it. There were no girls. There was a whole batch of Vietnamese kids that would hover on the edge of the beach, kind of down towards town. They weren't really allowed on the beach per se, but sometimes they got there and there wasn't any way to keep them off. It was interesting after I'd been there probably 3 or 4 or 5 months and got to know some of the people around and some of the kids, and got to recognize, and they got to recognize me, that sometimes they would steal things from blankets when military guys would go into the water or whatever. And you got to watch out for the water in Vietnam too, the jellyfish and sharks and all sorts of neat stuff. I learned that firsthand by seeing those jellyfish. Oh, those are pretty. Yeah. And they're kind of dangerous too, so don't step on one. But anyway, the beach is beautiful. They even had a BX, which was a store, and they had a restaurant, which you could get a hamburger, you could get French fries, you could get a milkshake. Of course, I only made $2,100 the year I was in Vietnam, so I didn't have a lot of cash to spend, but the hamburger cost 15 cents. You got to realize that cigarettes cost 21 cents, but we were rationed, and I didn't smoke, so I had a little extra money than some of the folks, because I could trade my rations to somebody else that smoked for 21 cents or whatever. I didn't care.
Now, aside from going to the beach, were you going off base for other reasons? Was there any place else you could go?
Well, there's certainly places to go. There was NCO Club, which I went to all the time. Could also go to the non-NCO, just the enlisted club. But they had shows that would come in. Monkey Mountain, if you've ever heard that term, in Vietnam, was very close to us as well, and that was where the Marines were stationed. They garnered quite a few national, international stars that would come over. Bob Hope got there, I think, one time during the year, but I couldn't get out there. I was either working, probably meeting that airplane or whatever, when he was in town. But there were several important people that would come in, and there were some singers, and the ones we really enjoyed the most were the Korean bands that would come in and imitate American singers. Those guys were fantastic at that. They couldn't speak English, but they could sing those songs. You know, I'm sure there was Chuck Berry in every single one of them. They were doing some good stuff. But I actually had a pretty good time. Most of the time was in Vietnam. It was good people, made some good friendships. Actually worked part-time for the Chase Manhattan Bank that also had an office. Since I was in accounting, they needed tellers. They hired a fellow by the name of Rumbaugh, I can't remember his first name, that worked with me, and they hired me just to be a clerk, probably for 3 or 4 months. But I always tell people that in Vietnam I worked for Chase Manhattan Bank. I was a teller for that, but it really wasn't. It was just a part-time thing. I was really a teller for the government. The last 6 months, besides taking some cash, and that only happened 3 or 4 times to some contractors, I was assigned the negative side of trading that military pay certificates. Instead of meeting the airplanes for the guys coming in and going out, I had to go to the hospitals and go from bed to bed to bed for those that were either wounded or getting shipped back because they were sick or whatever else, mentally or whatever else. I had to go and take their cash and trade that for them as well. And I guess I got good at it because they kept me in that job until I was ready to leave. I was looking forward to it every minute, and, sang the songs like everybody else did. And, I was getting short and getting ready to get out of the military. And when I did, just right out of the military. It was a couple months before my 4 years was up, but it was time. It was a good 4 years. The second piece of the story has to be mustering out and being told that you shouldn't wear your uniform outside the base because people don't like military and they don't like Vietnam War. And I know I heard part of that, but never really realized how negative the feeling was and pervasive the feeling was about Vietnam. And I thought I was doing something good. I was very patriotic about it. I was getting paid, I don't know, $25 extra because it was in a combat zone. I finally fulfilled the reason I joined the military by getting to Vietnam, and I thank that colonel for that. I would have felt cheated spending 4 years in the military during Vietnam, sitting in Texas or sitting any place else. So I'm glad I went. I'm glad I was there. Grew up a lot. I was ready for college when I got out of the military. I wasn't ready before I got into the military. But the interesting story that has to be told about anybody that was in Vietnam during that time is the attitude for the next 10 years after I got out of the military. Nobody wanted to hear the stories. Nobody could drag out those intimate things that happened during that particular day or that particular time. Nobody wanted to hear it. My parents didn't want to hear it. I told them maybe 1 or 2 stories, and that was enough. Okay, that now they know everything about what I did in the military. Go on to what's going to happen in the future. None of my friends wanted to talk about it, and it just didn't come up in normal conversation. Probably 7 or 8 months after I got out of the Air Force, maybe it was even later than that, maybe it was like 1972, a couple years later, that the state of Michigan sent us a check. Thank you for your work in Vietnam. And it was a check for $50. And it was almost like a slap in the face. It was every single one of us that ever talked about it, said, I can buy dinner, thanks. Oh boy. It wasn't a thank you. It was sweeping us under the carpet and saying that they did something for us. For $50, I didn't do that for $50. I didn't do that for anything but the freedoms of the United States and everything else. And maybe I was misguided, I don't know, but I think I wasn't. I think I did the right thing. It wasn't until 10 years, maybe 12 years, 15 years afterwards that I took a job, took a advisory position at a company in Holland, Michigan called Can Do, which is a help group that does interviewing and resume building, and they do a lot of things for people that are looking for work. I think they do the unemployment activities in Ottawa County as well. But Can Do is a helping group that had an advisory group that was really, what the advisors did was refer volunteers, find places that would give money, you know, whatever else. We were just basically advisors of how to do the training and how to do some of this other stuff. I was invited to be an advisor, and it sounded like a great idea, so I did. The person that met me at the door that was going to drive me over to where this first meeting was a fellow by the name of Michael Vu, and I'm sure his first name really wasn't Michael. It was probably Huang Chao Vu or something like that, but he changed it and anglicized it when he got shipped over as a young kid, probably 10 or 12 years old, in 1972 when they escaped Vietnam and came over to the United States and centered there. He was the one that happened to pick me up, and I'd noticed that he was Vietnamese, and you can tell the difference between a Vietnamese and a Korean and a Chinese person once you've been there and know, and there are major differences. And he was obviously a very nice young Vietnamese fella. And I mentioned, you know, that I was in Vietnam, and his eyes got wide. He stopped the car, and we were already driving. He stopped the car, and I didn't know what the heck was happening. He got out of the car, came around to the side where I was, made me get out of the car, held out his hand and shook my hand and said, "Thank you." I'm going to do it again. I cried. I had never been told thank you except for that stupid $50.
Right.
Nobody had cared. But I got it from him. He had made it his issue, his mission, to say thank you to everyone that he ever met that was in Vietnam and did that job. So I've made it my issue and my mission to do the same thing. So, sorry to...
The contrast between sort of that response coming home and this is pretty dramatic. It's a reminder here that, you know, when we were in places like Korea and Vietnam, and to one degree or another that may come out in the end for Iraq and Afghanistan as well. There'll be people, you know, who were there who actually saw what the Americans is doing as something other than being a bunch of imperialist whatevers, and that they really were people and that they were really trying to help. And you have to remember that the story is that complicated, and that's part of it too.
And it wasn't so much the time I spent in the military, because I knew what I was doing then.
Yes.
But it was the 15 years between leaving and being told at the muster out, saying, you might not want to wear your uniform out there. As a matter of fact, if you don't need them, throw them away. And I did, which was kind of, I really feel bad about that, because I could have used those 1505s in some of these military parades that they have, and Veterans Day and everything, on the 4th of July, that I've marched in and walked in as a veteran, but I didn't have my uniforms, and I would have liked to have kept that. I think I kept the hat with the emblem on it, but that was it. I didn't have the rest of the blues. But it was that 15 years of wanting to talk, I'm sure, wanting to just get it off and talk about all the good, bad, or indifferent things that happened, and the things I saw, and especially the bed-to-bed in the hospitals. Nobody wanted to hear it, but he wanted to say thank you. So,
all right. Now I want to back up to a couple other dimensions of that period in Vietnam. You were talking about the layout of the base and sort of in a way as a perimeter and so forth, and talking about having, you know, rockets fired at you or things like that. To what extent were you aware while you were there that you really were in a war zone? I mean, you had what was in many ways kind of a civilian type job, but did the base get fired upon regularly, and if so, by what?
Probably once a month or so, and maybe a couple times during the Tet period and whatever. Rockets were definitely sent at us, and what was kind of interesting about that is we could hear those rockets coming from way away, and we could almost tell how far past or whether they're coming close or whatever else. So a lot of the fellows got kind of jaded. They thought they could tell that the rocket wasn't going to, touch the barracks or whatever else. So they just stayed in their beds and whatever. I was pretty conscientious about getting out and getting down to that bunker myself. But a couple times was kind of interesting. After the rocket attack, might have been in 10 o'clock in the morning. It's middle of the day, and you get these rockets coming over. It wasn't always at 2 o'clock in the morning and in the middle of the night. These guys would sit out probably half a mile from the base, and they'd just set up this little launching pad, and they'd lob a couple of rockets in. What they were trying to do is take out the airplanes or the jets that were in the center, or maybe the Huey helicopters or whatever. But I saw the devastation that those rockets made, even in the middle of the street, right in front of our barracks, where one hit. It blasted the concrete, which is in the tar and whatever else was on there, probably 6 or 7 inches completely away. A 7-foot, 8-foot hole went down about 8 foot. But the military was so good at repairing those things, probably within 45 minutes, you couldn't tell it was ever done. They filled up that hole, they put that stuff back on the, you could see that, that wasn't the way it was before, but it was solid and ready to drive over in 45 minutes to an hour. And I got lots of pictures of the things that, things like that. But I didn't get really close. The only times I ever was even given a gun, a rifle, can't call it a gun, it was a rifle, was a couple times when we had noticed that insurgents or the Viet Cong were close, because we were close to the demilitarized zone. We were close to the north. They were coming close, and they were in the area, and they would issue us, if we were on call for protection of the perimeter, they would issue us a rifle and 6 bullets, which was always wondering to me, what good is 6 bullets? Mm-hmm. I mean, and if I see somebody, I'm going to probably shoot all 6, and okay, now what do I do? Just, walk away or run or whatever. Seems like they should have given us enough to, get us by for the whole evening or whatever. And this is a this is a M16, so it's a...
So you could squeeze off all 6 bullets.
Bam, then they're gone.
Yeah. So you had sort of regular Army or Marine guards or things like that around the base too.
Sure.
It wasn't just
we had the guys in the huts around the edge, and we also had the MPs that were always there. I mean, they were really in charge of the perimeter guard. But me as an accountant, I mean, I guess that I was on call a couple times, because I remember getting that rifle and getting that issue of the 6 bullets.
And once you had the rifle, what did you do? You just stand around?
No, we were actually led out to one edge of the airport, mm-hmm. And we were stationed there and spread out with 1 or 2 people that were kind of in charge of the group. And they would just leave us there for 45 minutes, never saw anything, it was maybe closer to 2 or 3 hours, and never saw or heard anything. So finally they got us up and walked us back to, turned in our rifle, turned in our bullets.
Now, were there I think you mentioned sniper attacks? I mean, did that go on?
I didn't see any or hear any, but I heard about several of them mm-hmm. that were sniping at the helicopters that were coming off the helicopter pad by the hospital. I got told by the nurses, because again, I got to know the nurses and I got to know the folks over at the hospital what I was going through, and
right.
Stationed at that particular point in the accounting office. But I got to know some of the Vietnamese mama sans that worked in the different barracks to clean up. There was at least 2 assigned to every building. That interesting people. I even got invited to one of their homes for an evening meal, which was unheard of. I didn't know of anybody else that got that kind of invitation, so I must have done something right or whatever. She invited me to meet her parents, and they lived in a little village kind of connected to the base, but not on the base. We had to actually go through the exit gate, but their little hut was outside of that. And had a dinner that I could not describe. Had no idea what we were eating, but did my best at tasting.
Were there concerns, sort of security concerns, about Vietnamese people working on the base?
Of course, we always worried about whether these and I guess they had some kind of interview process and whatever else. But you know, some of the mama sons were 50 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them could have been 30 years old and looked 50 as well. I don't know. But some of them were 12 and 13 and 14 years old. Interesting thing is they have different concepts of what's right and what's moral, whatever. I mean, you know, nudity is not anything to them. I mean, they would go in these barracks and the mama sons would walk right down where all the guys are taking their showers and they'd be taking their own shower. It just didn't matter to them. It was just an interesting concept to adjust to. There's no sex involved. It was just weird that they just don't have the same feelings about some of the things that we do. But they were there just as part of the family, and their jobs were to actually, one of the things I liked about it is they would polish our shoes. They wouldn't do the spit shine stuff, but they would polish our shoes, they would dust the room, they would make the beds even for those folks that weren't there during the day. Yeah, it was kind of like having a maid. And,
now, were there other Vietnamese working on the base, either military or civilian?
there were a few. There was definitely some translators that we needed. We had some translators in the accounting office that we pulled in whenever one of the foreign nationals or one of the military of the Vietnam that was working with us would come in and they'd have money and we'd have to switch that over, or they'd have some other business to do with the accounting office, and we'd have to talk to them. We had half a dozen of the secretaries were Vietnamese girls that worked in our accounting office. Certainly there were the waitresses in the different places. They weren't all military employees that worked in the restaurants and the NCO clubs and the whatever, officers clubs or whatever. Yeah, there was quite a few civilians that worked throughout the base.
Okay. Now, what were the dates when you were actually in Vietnam?
April of '68 through April of '69.
Okay. Now, that's a period when you've had, I mean, kind of the Tet Offensive had sort of started early in the year.
Right.
And then you have the ramifications of that playing out for a few months after that.
You know, we knew it. We knew what was going on, but it didn't feel any different on a day-to-day basis, you know, whether that was going on. It was just, we saw heightened activities going on, more trucks going in and out and Marines coming through. Air Force and Marines and Army have a great relationship, especially at the supply folks. Marines seem to get the better food for whatever reason.
That's not what the Marines will tell you.
You know, except that they traded most of that food to get other things that they wanted, like boots, and we, for whatever reason, the Air Force got better boots, better fatigues, I don't know, whatever, but they wanted to trade those things over. But we had lots of steak outings, thanks to the Marines. But they also wanted their money taken care of, too, so we kind of had something over them. And we took care of the finances for a lot of the different military activities. It wasn't just Air Force.
Did you have any sense of how the war effort itself was going?
We were pretty well kept in touch with, whether it was reality or not, I don't know. We definitely had the local radio stations, because I had the only TV set in the area. I got to see, you know, some of the little Vietnam news stations, and some of it was overlaid with American, you know, words and stuff. It was kind of fun to try to understand what was going on from their aspect as well. It was probably even less sophisticated than the community type of TV station like this is. I mean, but they had TV stations, and but they were probably put in the back room of a warehouse or something, and they just put a camera up and started shooting and do news articles, and they would have some woman that would talk about the weather or whatever, and you know, it was kind of fun to watch that.
Did you have any sense of things like whether the war effort itself was going well or not, or
I still don't know how it was going. To this day, I really don't know if it was if there was an up and down. We were there for a particular job. I was there for a totally different job than fighting the war. I was just support, accounting and finance, and you know, doing paperwork and making sure that the cogs of the business actually went through.
I guess the place where you would see a certain amount of it was when you were going into the hospital and so forth, and you were dealing with the wounded
Sure.
and that kind
Absolutely.
of thing.
And talking to the Marine guys that we got to know, and even out to China Beach when I was on my little daily R&Rs. And I tell you, I went out there as often as I possibly could. So I took, the bus driver knew me by name, so I would get on there and we'd have a nice ride. I would take pictures of some of he would actually drive a little bit different every once in a while so I could see and take pictures of some of the fancier homes. Mm-hmm. And there were fancy homes over there, and there were gated communities over there. I've even got some pictures of of what looked like to me a mansion. Mm-hmm. That had a nice cement wall built around it, and nice foliage in there, bunch of people hanging around in there, and it very oriental looking, but it was really kind of cool. But the driver would take me into the different areas. Now downtown Da Nang and downtown Pleiku, it could not possibly be considered a downtown anyplace else but in those areas. Mm-hmm. The dirt roads that were the side streets that were narrow enough to get maybe 2 motorcycles and 3 bicycles, but not 2 cars at the same time up and down those roads, was the things I was looking for to take pictures of. Totally different than East Grand Rapids, Michigan, mm-hmm. or Hudsonville, where I live now, or anything else in the United States. There are no places in the whole of the United States that I can even imagine that were anything close to this. And I've been to Four Corners, and I've been out to Arizona, and I've driven through the deserts out there, but that's not what I mean. This is where people live, mm-hmm. that are so at the low end of the scale in terms of homes and housing and yearly and annual incomes and all that kind of thing. I don't think they had much. But there are also the hierarchy of the people that ran the government, and I'm sure that they had those nice homes. And somebody had money someplace, but what they did and how they got through day to day, I don't know. I don't know what they were.
Well, it was part of the larger political issue with
Sure.
the whole thing. You had that many people living in that much poverty. And
that much poverty and that much money and nothing in between. There's no middle
yeah.
class. I never saw a middle class there at all.
You were talking about going into seeing downtown Da Nang or Pleiku and so forth. What occasions did you have to go into those places?
The reason I went to Pleiku was to take money to contractors. Something probably in my captain's head decided that I would be a good person to send down there. It was not an overt right. progression. It was just one day I got this assignment.
Yeah, that was a little farther away. Now, did people go off the base and into Da Nang for any reason otherwise?
No, you had to have special pass. You had a special reason. You had to have escort. Mm-hmm. No, they were not able to walk off the base and just wander around right. in Vietnam. You just didn't do that. They had to know where you were. You had to have a pass. You had to have papers. You had to have reasons. And even if you're going, close to the edge of the base, you could be, collared and questioned and try to figure out why you're doing something that's a little abnormal. Mm-hmm.
So it makes for a certain kind of almost insular existence. I mean, you're kind of there with the base with these people, and you're aware of certain parts of what's going on around you and not necessarily others, and you
right.
stay focused pretty much on the task that's
Stay focused on the task, and what was interesting is most people worked, went to the NCO club, and they had slot machines, and they had, it was fun. It was, they had drinks, and they were cheap. I mean, you could get almost anything you needed to for a nickel. I mean, it was just the BX down the street or the PX that you could get to the store. You could buy anything that you wanted at government discount rate, whatever. Money was not too much of an issue. We never had any, for one thing. I mean, we only had probably $75 every paycheck, or even that, I would be surprised. We had everything taken care of. We had our clothes, and we had our housing and medical. Everything was taken care of there. If we had toothache or something, we'd get that taken care of, no cost. I can't imagine wanting for much, except maybe a picture frame or a radio, or I did get a nice camera while I was over there. I got a Yashica Hong Kong people would come over and they'd build you a suit for $17 or $18, and a complete suit, you know, coat, vest, you know, pants, and they'd fit it to you and everything else, and $18, you know, that was it. I did take my R&R to Australia, and I had a wonderful time in Australia. That could be another 45 minutes of discussion just for those 2 weeks I was down there. But I got conned by a guy in Australia that said he worked for the Australian embassy. Found out much later that he didn't, but we gave him money, but he usually spent it on us, buying us drinks and everything else. The day we tripped up on it, I went down there for the Christmas week or a couple weeks. You know, the day he got tripped up on it is, for whatever reason, he promised he was going to take us out on the embassy yacht. There wasn't an embassy yacht, but whatever, he was going to take us out. So that was, he must have known he was going away for a couple weeks or something, because he knew that we would find out that there wasn't one, because we showed up trying to get on this embassy yacht. Came up to the embassy, knocked on the door, and we mentioned this guy's name, and they said, we've been looking for him for quite a while. He doesn't work for us, but by the way, we're having our Christmas party. Would you two guys like to come up and join? Yeah, wonderful. We got invited to the Canadian Embassy Christmas party and got to meet some people there. I got to meet a family that were named Stewarts. Mr. Stewart, the lady that asked me to come was Christine Stewart. And it was her father owned Stewart Wines, which was a very large winery in Australia, and got invited over to their home for Christmas party and for Christmas Day, and they treated me just like family. I felt like I was home, you know, for that period of time. And these were Australian folks that didn't know anything about me, but had invited me to this Christmas party at the embassy, and then she had invited me to her home for Christmas parties. It was actually a neighborhood party that we got together with. And the interesting thing that happened at this party is they had just gotten, in that neighborhood, the police had just gotten their first breathalyzer that they were going to start testing. And they brought it to this party to show off their breathalyzer. This was 1968, so this was Christmas of '68. So Christine and I got to know each other pretty well. Her older sister had married a Navy guy, and they had already moved back to the United States. He had already gotten out of the service. But she was pregnant at the time that I was at this Christmas party, the sister was, and wanted Christine to come visit her in July of the next year. I was going to be out of the military at that time. I was going to be home in Michigan. Her parents and Christine asked me if I would meet Christine at the airport in New York and drive her up to Buffalo, which was not a short drive, because she didn't know anything about the United States, or you know what she could do, or how she was going to get to the next leg. And I said, sure. So in July, after I got out of the military, I drove to New York, saw an old girlfriend there for a while, but ended up marrying the old girlfriend. But met Christine at the airport and drove her up to her sister's house and spent 2 or 3 really nice days there as well. The plan was that Christine would also come visit me in Michigan afterwards, but ended up getting engaged to this other girl. So,
all right. Now, once you did come back from Vietnam, then what did you do next?
First of all, I went back to the job that I'd had before. I worked at Meijer's as a Meijer Markets at the Thrifty Acres, number 11 on 28th Street in Kalamazoo, their first one. Right. Worked at Thrifty Acres there as a marking clerk, working in the marking room, put little tags prices on them. Went right back to there, and they gave me my job back, even though they didn't have to. I don't think the rules were that they had to give me my job back after 4 years, but they did, and I started working there. And within 2 months from that job, I still kept that job, but I also worked at Spartan Stores. Now, competitive issues the way they are between Spartan Stores and Thrifty Acres, I was in an ideal position. I was in the marking room, pricing at Thrifty Acres. I was an inventory clerk, dealing with pricing and inventory at Spartan Stores. Perfect place to, you know, have all the information. I was without a clue. They didn't know that I worked either place, and either place didn't know I was working the other. Well, I worked at Myers, probably stayed there another 6 months or so, and then stayed with Spartan for another couple of years. But that's what I did immediately. And then I took a job as a warehouse guy at warehouse in accounting. I still thought I was going to be an accountant for a company called Celanese Corporation, DeVoe Paint, and started working at a warehouse in Grand Rapids. For about 6 or 7 months, I worked in the office as the accountant, and a sales job happened to pop up, and I asked if I could have a couple accounts, just small accounts that we were doing business with, like Amway. Happened to be a good account to take on. Built that company revenue with DeVoe Paint from $17 or $18 a month. You know, they'd just come in and buy a gallon of paint or whatever, to about $20,000 to $30,000 worth of business. And at that time, it was pretty good business. And then they came up with a product special to DeVoe Paint, which is a high-build latex, and it was the area where a lot of guys were getting out of the military and were building a lot of apartment complex, and a lot of other kinds of things were happening, that housing was becoming a very big thing necessary for military guys getting out. So this high-build latex was a one-time shot. They built up to 21, 22 mils on a wall without draping. Right. So that was, again, kind of towards the helping the military, but it was a product that we were doing. The closest thing I got to working with the military again after the military, the progression was getting out, warehouse accounting, thinking I was going into accounting. I took classes at community college. At nights, weekends, I worked 3 jobs. You know, I worked even at Howard Johnson's at night to do studying, and while I was, you know, just newly married, coming up in August or September of that year, the year I got out, going to college, two jobs at least, and sometimes 3, just making ends meet, and then soon after that having a family and going through that. But in middle of the 70s, which is about 10 years later, or 8 years later, organization was in town called United Electronics Institute, which was a tech school. It has molded into, and I'll tell you a little bit why, into ITT Tech, which is still here in town. I was a sales manager there, but at the beginning, I was hired by a group called George Shin and Associates, which was a consultant firm to tech schools. And what they did was they taught tech schools and trade schools and business schools how to recruit veterans, how to go to the crisscross directory, the Polk directory, and find the names as you go through there page by page that they were a veteran or military. Education gets paid by the military. We had the ability of using Veterans Administration money, and UEI was a hurting school. They had 70 students in the school, but these veterans coming back from the military, getting out of the service finally, started, instead of UEI going out to the high schools and trying to draw in graduating high school seniors, we started the impacted, and my job, actually paid by George Shin, not by UEI, paid by George Shin Associates consultants to get the recruits from the military. And I built that school at just in the 2 years from 77 through 79, from 70 students in the school to over 400. With almost 200 of that 400 primed and ready to start in July of 1969, when ITT Tech, ITT Educational Services, decided they wanted to buy UEI. There were 10 schools across the country, but only 2 of them were growing. Grand Rapids, where I was active, they made me the assistant manager of there as soon as I started getting some of these numbers. And a fellow by the name of Fred Weber was the director, the sales director, and he just kind of put his arm around me and let me work. And about halfway through 69, when ITT started, George Shin and Associates wanted to know why I was so successful and why these other 10, they were consulting to all 10, why they weren't. They called me down to North Carolina to a meeting to tell them all my secrets. I said, okay, I'll tell you all my secrets. I work 7 days a week. I work 12 hours a day. I set up 10 to 12 interviews every single day. I call for 4 hours a day, and I get all these people coming in, and I play ping pong with them. And we had 3 ping pong tables. There were all my sales guys were active playing ping pong with all these Vietnam veterans. And we recruited, I had, again, 258 students primed for the July start in 1969. The sale was culminated before those students actually showed up because there was an encumbrance of those funds. ITT had to pay me as if those kids showed up a month and a half before they actually showed up for school. So I got the largest commission check ever given by that company for bringing those 250 students in. Probably about 180 of them showed up, but I got paid for all 250 of them as if they showed up just to get rid of the encumbrance. But that was veterans, and we continued to bring veterans in with the plans that George Shin had shown us how to do, but I was actually hired by ITT Tech when they came in. Straight commission with UEI, company car, expense account, and everything else, but it was all based on George Shin's plan of bringing in. George Shin, by the way, won the Pulitzer Prize for writing a book or something. It was a pretty important thing. And part of his talent was in recruiting. That's what he promoted. That was his whole company. Portland, Oregon, and Grand Rapids, Michigan were the only 2 of the 10 schools that ITT bought. And now that ITT Tech, I'm still an advisor to them, still on their advisory board. It's still a good school. They're teaching a lot of different things at this point, but I worked for them for about 5 more years after that. Lots of interesting things happened there, but I was a director of sales, and we had some amazing years, but most of it was due to the veterans coming out of the Vietnam area. So if you ever went to ITT as a veteran, it's probably because of somebody like me. So that's I've always been kind of drawn to helping as many as I can.
Okay. Now, if you wanted to kind of look back on the whole thing now, how do you think your time in the military wound up affecting you overall?
I would have been a totally different person. Probably wouldn't have learned those sales words from Bill Boyer. Probably, I don't know, I would be a totally different type of person. If I had tried to go to college at that time, I would have failed miserably. I might have just, stayed with my job at Meyer. I'd probably still be working at Meyer. I'd still be working as a clerk in the back room or something. I don't know. I really don't know. I pat myself on the back all the time thinking I'm better than that, but I don't know. The military definitely took me down to a 2-year-old and grew me back up to being somebody self-sufficient. And if you ask my wife about whether I can be self-sufficient, she would say no, but I know I can, if I want to.
All right.
I've got those options.
Are there any other kind of individual events or things or stuff that sort of sticks in your mind or comes back to you a lot from your time in the service that you haven't mentioned here yet?
The time I spent in Texas was probably an interesting time, basically because it was so different from anything else I've ever done. For that 2.5 years, I had no parents, had no responsibilities. I had my job to go to. I had my own car. I had my own income. Had my own friends, and I, again, didn't have brothers around or anything else. I was totally free. When I got out of the military, went back home, lived at home for probably 3 or 4 months before I got my own apartment, and ended up getting married pretty quickly after that, marrying that girl from New York that I went visited when I picked up Christine. But that 2.5 years was, West Texas is totally different than Michigan too. I keep going back to those 2.5 years and wondering if I gotten out of the military and gone back there, because I had friends there, I could have gone. I was even asked to go. I'd be a Texan instead of somebody from Michigan. So I don't think too much about Chanute Air Force Base. I was there for that training, and that seemed like one long day. I mean, I was there for probably 4 months or so and just don't remember much of it except for the pizza that got delivered at night. Regularly, the pizza truck would come by and they had the most wonderful little pizzas with sausage on it. And every time I go out to Fricato's here locally, they got the sausage that tastes just like those little pizzas that they had down there that delivered in those little trucks. But that was, I had a good time in the military, but I definitely would not have been a good career military person.
All right. Well, thanks for a good story, and thanks for coming and telling it to us today.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Now we can just move these things out, switch the mics off.